Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I really don't know what to tell you about today's story, how much of it is true, how much of it is made up. This I do know, and you can look this up online. In 1905, the great magician and escape artist Harry Houdini had returned to New York from a very successful European tour. He had money to burn, and he bought a summer house in Connecticut. He also bought what was called a mansion. We would probably call it a brownstone, but that was in the Harlem neighborhood of New York. Harlem looks pretty different these days, but that's to be expected. We also know that later in life he was on something of a mission to defraud spiritualist mediums. Now, that came from somewhere, and this story gives us an insight into one possible reason why that came about. But as I say, I don't know. I inherited these stories from my great-grand-aunt. Her birth name was Ludmila Prosilova. She went by the name Lucille Parcell. In this story, she's going by Lida, which is a nickname for Ludmila, so she's, trying to get back something of her Czech roots. I don't know where this leaves us. All I'm going to do is read you this Vera Vance-like ghostly mystery titled Houdini Slept Here. Vera Vance-like and I were in her office at the Hotel Manitou. We were in the midst of reducing the large number of magazines she had accumulated over the years, weeding an unbound garden of articles about topics both natural and supernatural. The latter prompted me to ask Vera why she never wrote about her investigations into ghostly phenomenon. Her skills in the publishing field, I reasoned, would likely lead to a profitable return on such chronicles.
Harry Ascot is the reason, Vera said. I've mentioned Harry, yes?
Your mentor in the field of occultism. I had heard several of Vera's tales about this fascinating gentleman who had passed away before I met her. In my mind, he shimmered with the radiance of legend.
Yes, my mentor. Early in his career, he had granted permission to an aspiring writer to pen a couple of his experiences. That writer took the liberty of presenting both cases as if recorded by Harry himself, perhaps for the dramatic effect that goes with first-hand accounts of the supernatural. They were published in this manner, published in a magazine of some prominence.
Vera took a moment to locate and then hand me a recent copy of Harper's Monthly, showing that the journal still thrived. I checked this specific issue's date and added it to the keep pile. Often preferring the past to the present, Vera sat down to reminisce.
You see, spectral encounters are better related by a reporter who brings some objectivity to the subject. By impersonating Harry himself, the writer inadvertently prompted many readers to view my mentor either as a liar or a lunatic. She put two fingers to the side of her jaw, her usual pose for contemplation. I imagine that allowing that fellow to mention Harry's penchant for opium, entirely accurate, mind you, only worsened the portrait.
Your Mr. Ascot, I replied, learned a painful lesson in becoming a public figure.
And passed it along to me decades later, Vera added. You know, if I hadn't been so young when I knew him, I could have written some of Harry's exploits from the perspective of his assistant. One day I ought to do exactly that.
A Dr. Watson to his Sherlock Holmes, I suggested. This time I spotted and lifted a copy of Collier's, which ran Arthur Conan Doyle's popular series. Were the great detective to tell his own stories, he might be seen as a braggart, prone to wild exaggeration. She nodded.
Were my own ghost investigations put to paper, it would be better for you to be holding the pen.
She chuckled at the notion. I was stung by her reaction to the prospect of my chronicling our cases. I was quite an avid reader, and once or twice I had considered fashioning a story of my own. Rather than defend myself, though, I tossed the copy of Collier's onto the rubbish pile and continued working silently.
Besides, Vera resumed, there are the reputations of our clients to respect.
This final comment is well illustrated by a case we handled for another man named Harry. Attempting to mask our client's identity would be foolhardy, since the magician is internationally recognized for escaping from handcuffs, padlocked chains, or trunks, and almost any other kind of restraint. Many years will have to pass before readers no longer recognize the personage known as Harry Houdini. In 1905, however, most Americans probably would have had trouble distinguishing Houdini from spaghetti, both being new attractions here at the time. Though Vera and I had enjoyed the Italian noodles, neither of us had heard of the showman. Nonetheless, Mr. Houdini had heard of Vera Van Slyke. "It's your book about the tricks of spiritualist mediums that brings me here, Miss Van Slyke," he explained as he sat down in the parlor at the Manitou. Mr. Houdini bore the trace of a Central European accent, much like the voices in the Chicago neighborhood of my youth. Though possibly half a foot shorter than Vera, his vibrant presence very likely would have dwarfed hers were they to share, say, a lecture stage. At the same time, I remember that his habit of parting his hair in the middle made his head look almost humorously flat on top. "You've read Spirit Shouldn't Sneeze? That's odd," Vera replied. "I've reached a far larger readership by authoring a short newspaper advertisement." He grinned. "Ah, you must mean your offer to help the haunted." "Yes, you see, I've studied you carefully before coming here. You're defrauding mediums with one hand while allegedly exorcising ghosts with the other makes you the very person to consult in regard to my dilemma." I saw Vera's lips tighten with the magician's suggestion that her dealings with the supernatural were dishonest. However, she allowed him to continue. He laced his fingers together. "My dilemma might be compared to that of a poacher trapped in a tree by the dogs of the country squire. Imagine the squire himself holding off his dogs and demanding money from the poacher. Now, replace that squire with a spiritualist medium named Alexander Lavelle, and replace the dogs with a ghost. A ghost that Lavelle claims will haunt me if I don't pay him a considerable fee." Vera picked up a pair of scissors from her desk. She worked the blades as she said, "Lida, you were among those I interviewed for that book. Are mediums capable of commanding ghosts to do their bidding?" Despite my sudden blush at having my former profession exposed, I stated evenly, "Oh, mediums are capable of doing anything their clients believe they can do." "Ghosts," insisted Vera, "perceive things far too clearly to be so easily led. This, Mr. Houdini, is also why ghosts seldom attend magic shows." The magician glanced between Vera and me with a twinkle in his eye. He then admitted, "Forgive my speaking facetiously. I had to see how you would react to the case as it is being presented to me. Needless to say, I'm being flim-flammed. But, you see, I have been caught poaching, in a manner of speaking, and this Lavelle fellow claims he gets his information about my crime from the world beyond. Either I pay him, or he embarrasses me publicly, thereby advancing his own career. The situation must be handled gingerly, like picking a lock with a horsehair." "Occasionally a lock is better opened with an iron mallet," Vera responded, setting down the scissors. "Please openly tell us the details of your crime. I haven't time for horsehairs." The magician collected his thoughts before speaking. "As the last century came to a close, and after years of my traveling with circuses and medicine shows, I finally broke onto the vaudeville stage. Success can misguide a young man on the road, and I've always been, let me call it, vigorous, physically vigorous. I pray I do not shock you fine ladies, but I made the mistake of associating with a certain red-headed dancer, and this is despite the fact that, despite my being married at the time." Vera and I both shifted in our chairs.
Mr. Houdini continued. The dalliance with the dancer was short-lived. After it had ended, Bess, she's my wife, and I decided that an extended tour through Europe might bring my career to fruition. That is where we have spent the last several years. Vera raised her finger. The showgirl, I presume, was left behind stateside? Correct, Miss Van Slyke. But then we returned stateside. I had experienced great fortune in Europe, which left me with, well, a great fortune. I'm no Astor, mind you, but I suppose I could have been less public about my new wealth. For instance, it's no secret that I purchased a couple of houses. One is a summer house in Connecticut, the other is a modest mansion in New York City. A modest mansion, Vera said with a chuckle. Those are words seldom put together. Has she contacted you? I inquired. The red-headed dancer, I mean. Not directly. No, not directly. Mr. Houdini lifted a valise he had from beside his feet. From it he withdrew a photograph, which he then handed to Vera. Vera perused the photograph before passing it to me. It displayed a gentleman who wore an eye patch, crouching forward in a wooden chair. The tips of his fingers were pressing his temples. Above and to the side of him floated the face of a woman without a body. A gossamer material encircled her head. On the wall behind them hung a certificate of some kind, perhaps a college diploma. That certificate showed through the floating head and the delicate substance that surrounded it. Vera sighed heavily. It's dumbfounding that these are still being passed off as authentic. If you read my book, sir, you know that I devote a chapter to how such proof positive of psychic powers is manufactured. 2 exposures. The medium and the camera remain perfectly still for both. The spirit comes in for just 1 exposure, dressed in black except for whatever fluff serves as ectoplasm, and of course her face. The officious certificate in the background is a novel touch. It's usually a vase of flowers. Mr. Houdini again peered into his valise. I was quite ready to accept the photograph as a fake. However, it was accompanied by this. He handed Vera a newspaper clipping. Again, after Vera had inspected the item, she passed it to me. It was a death notice for a woman named Dolly Dunwhiddle. According to the description, the deceased had been a dancer who died at the age of 29. No cause of death was provided. Am I to understand, Vera said, that this unfortunate woman is the red-headed showgirl with whom you were vigorous prior to your European tour? A look of sincere sorrow descended across Mr. Houdini's face. The very same, he mumbled. And that most certainly is her face floating in the photograph. Lavelle informs me that her spirit contacted him after she had committed suicide. Mr. Houdini slumped in his chair and let his gaze drift to the side. Vera then clapped her hands together very loudly. There was a joyful grimace on her face. Mr. Houdini's eyes darted from her to me and back to her. I had some idea of what Vera was thinking. A hoax coupled with a hoax, I exclaimed. As soon as I heard my words, I realized I should have shown greater sympathy to our guest. Vera explained. There are many items submitted to newspapers that good editors will carefully check before publishing. However, a death notice is not among them. Who would run a false report of a death, after all? Oh, I imagine it's been done, perhaps to escape the law, but this is as fraudulent as that certificate in your ghost photograph, Mr. Houdini. If you were fooled by it, we can blame your being dazed by the claim that this woman from your past took her own life. But were you fooled by it? I asked, noticing the twinkle returning to Mr. Houdini's eye. He shrugged, casting off his pretense of sorrow with as much disregard as a dog shakes rainwater onto whoever is nearby. No, I was not fooled, he admitted. At this point, however, the magician folded his arms. He next began to bite his thumbnail. Vera asked. "Is there something more? Something not as easily explained?" Mr. Houdini slowly nodded. Though this man was proving himself to be as talented an actor as a magician, my intuition told me that we were now seeing him genuinely seeking Vera's expertise. He spoke solemnly. "At night, when Bess is asleep beside me, I've started to hear whispers. They started shortly after the photograph and death notice arrived. The whispers might be products of my own conscience, I suppose, but can one's conscience actually articulate words? If so, how can they seem to come at varying distances? At first the whispers are about 5 or 6 feet away, barely perceptible. Suddenly they'll be an inch or less from my ear. That's when I jolt. That's when I worry I'll wake Bess. And that's when I fear that Bess will hear the whispers too." "A difficult trick, to be sure," Vera mused aloud. "Assuming this Miss Dunwiddle, I corrected. Miss Dunwiddle is still alive," she continued. "I imagine it would be her voice that speaks to you at night. The whispers are so quiet that I'm unable to tell if they come from a woman or a man. I've scrutinized the bedroom from top to bottom for an explanation. A hidden telephone of some kind, a pipe, perhaps echoes through the chimney. To my shame, I haven't a clue how those whispers are being produced." "Curious," Vera responded. "And what do the whispers tell you?" Mr. Houdini faced Vera a long time before saying, "One thing, only one thing. The voice bids me, 'Tell her I'm sorry for what I did.' Only that, over and over. Tell her I'm sorry for what I did."
Along with a persuasive promise of payment and a trip to New York City, Mr. Houdini provided us with 2 tickets to his performance at the Colonial Theater on Broadway. We attended the show on the same day that we had arrived from Chicago. Despite the ladies who levitated, the feats of mental telepathy, and the escapes from tight coils of chains, Vera kept a sharp eye on the audience. I assumed she had been hoping to spot, if not Dolly Dunwiddle, then at least Alexander Lavelle. I knew that his happening to be in attendance at this show would be an astonishing coincidence. However, he would be easily recognized, given his eye patch. As it turned out, when the house lights rose at intermission, Vera explained, "I figured I might catch sight of some of my old newspaper cronies. Silly of me, isn't it, to think that New York has been poised and waiting these 4 years for my return." I smiled at both our faulty assumptions. "Well," I stated, "as this show illustrates, humanity is ever eager to believe in the unlikely." I felt as if my comment had encapsulated an ageless truth. However, before intermission was over, my companion had bumped into not one but 2 of her former professional colleagues. Such was life with Vera Van Slyke. The band called the audience back to its seats for the second half of the entertainment. Vera leaned toward my ear. "Do you mind letting our client know we've arrived? Slip backstage after the show and tell him that we're prepared to investigate his ghostly whispers at his discretion. I'd do it myself, but I've been invited out for beers with a couple of my old news hounds." "Yes, of course," I answered as the curtain rose. No, I don't mind. Yes, you should go reacquaint yourself with your friends." As the audience applauded Mr. Houdini's return, I felt myself suddenly discomforted. Was I to find my way back to our hotel on my own? Had Vera forgotten that I was a stranger in New York? I chose to blame my suddenly sour mood on the fatigue from our long trip. These sentiments only worsened during the long wait to speak with our client after his finale. I was jostled this way and that by shouting stagehands and saucy showgirls. However, once I was admitted to his dressing room, Mr. Houdini greeted me with refreshing congeniality. "Miss Parcell," he hailed, "how wonderful to see you again. But where is Miss Van Slyke, resting at the hotel?" "I fear she was shanghaied by a roving crew of newspaper reporters," I replied with a grin. She says that your performance was superb, however, and she looks forward to beginning the investigation." Mr. Houdini dragged a chair over and offered it with a grand flourish, as if he were displaying one of his magical cabinets. "Oh, thank you," I told him, "but I'm only here to notify you of our arrival and to tell you that we stand ready with our duplicate photograph and death notice." "Wonderful," he cheered. "Tell me, who posed as the medium and the ghost?" "A friend of mine named Rick Bergson served as the psychic. I assumed the role of the ghost myself. You see, I have some previous experience in the ectoplasm business." "Yes, I recall Miss Van Slyke mentioning that," he said, nodding to the chair. "I must confess I also did a stint as one of these blasted spiritualists." "Did you?" I realized my sour mood had passed, and I accepted the chair. "Now, what was the name used for the obituary notice?" "The dearly departed was named Lucille Parcell. A bit of significance in that. But much like our having once conducted seances, that tale should be kept under lock and key." "I know some things about unfastening locks," the magician quipped as he scooted his chair closer to mine. "Speaking of names," I scolded with a smirk, "Houdini sounds suspiciously like a stage name. Is it your real name?" He laughed with a bit of a blush. "I was born with the name Eric Weiss." "I see. And where were you born?" "Appleton, Wisconsin." "Odd. I thought I heard a trace of an accent in your speech, an accent from much further away than Wisconsin." "Ah, well," he leaned forward. "Perhaps these several years in Europe has me sounding a bit like my parents. They came from Budapest." "That's a fine explanation," I conceded. I had an inkling that I might be witnessing yet another of the magician's tricks, but I saw no reason to dwell upon it. "I'm originally from Prague. Say, during your stay in Europe, did you happen to visit—" "Oh, but listen to me blather. I'm sure you'll want to return home after your strenuous performance." Mr. Houdini scooted his chair still closer to me. "As it happens, I'm in no rush to return home." His eyes drifted sidelong. "You see, in order that you and Miss Van Slyke will be able to freely perform your investigation, I invented a reason for my wife and the rest of my family to stay in our Connecticut home for a few days. This means I'll be sleeping alone tonight." He returned his gaze to me. "I do so hate to sleep alone." He then gently took my hand into his own. Perhaps my response could be attributed to his physical proximity, or to my fatigue from the long trip, or to my earlier sourness. Regardless of the cause, after reclaiming my hand as my own, I squinted at Mr. Houdini a moment. I then inquired, "Has anyone ever told you that parting your hair in the middle makes your head look almost perfectly flat?" His brow furrowed. He leaned back in his chair. "I must say that this is the first time I've heard that. You don't think it makes me look distinguished?" It makes me wonder how many books you could balance up there." Mr. Houdini crossed his legs. "Perhaps I could make that part of my show." "Oh, would you listen to me?" I giggled. "It has been a long trip, hasn't it? Your idea about resting at the hotel is a very wise one. Thank you for suggesting it." I giggled again as I rose from my chair. Without shaking my hand, Mr. Houdini escorted me to the door. We curtly arranged a time when Vera and I could conduct our investigation of his bedroom. I found my own way out of the theater. Though I also made the trip back to the hotel alone, I admit that I allowed another few giggles to sneak out from time to time. The next evening, Vera and I went to our client's modest mansion in a neighborhood called Harlem. It was an area of the growing city that real estate speculators had eyed with great hope. Vera was pleased by this, but less so by the other changes that had happened in New York during her absence. She mentioned that the subway train, which had been completed the previous year, could carry us to Harlem. She seemed wary about such a mode of travel, though. I insisted we ride the new subway. Subsequently, I found the ride to be a thrilling one. "We shall never do that again," Vera declared once we returned to street level. "I prefer a private coffin when I'm buried, thank you, and a far more stationary one." After we arrived at the Houdini residence, our host greeted Vera with the cheerfulness he had shown me the previous evening. He was standoffish toward me, though, often aiming his responses to my conversation at Vera instead of me. I became even more quiet than usual. Before long, he was taking us to the room where he had heard the mysterious whispers. He granted us entry with one of his grand gestures that seemed better suited for the stage. The boudoir was ornately furnished, and its walls were decorated with memorabilia from our client's predecessors in the profession of illusions. The scent of rosewater wafted from Mrs. Houdini's vanity. "I sleep on this side of the bed," Mr. Houdini commented as his hand circled above one of the pillows, "and so the whispers must come from this vicinity." Vera nodded as she found a spot to place her satchel. I put our 2 black oboe cases beside it. Our host continued, "Rest assured that I am very much intrigued by your procedures. However, I am sorry to say that I won't be joining you during your investigation. A new book has arrived, you see, one that has traveled far to meet me." He bowed. "By all means, attend to your book," Vera replied. She had already begun scanning the corners and crannies of the room. "But I do have one question. What is your usual bedtime? If the lights going out in this room act as a signal to someone waiting outside, I'll want to recreate that with the hope that the whispers will appear." She returned to her examination. "On nights when I have no show, I generally go to bed around 10:30. Bess does, that is. Sometimes I'll stay up later, but I don't turn the lights back on, of course." Mr. Houdini glanced at me and then quickly diverted his eyes. Next he added, "I very much hope you can tell me all that you discovered tomorrow morning. Shall we plan on sharing breakfast?" Vera spun from looking behind a dresser to face our client. "Not lunch?" she implored. "Can we plan on lunch?" I attempted to explain Vera's plea by saying, "We're likely to be very tired tomorrow morning." Without turning to me at all, Mr. Houdini smiled at Vera. "Lunch, then. Should there be even the smallest emergency, I can be found in the library or later in my mother's bedroom. I'll be sleeping in her bed tonight." He bid us good luck and closed the door behind himself. Vera put a finger behind her ear and froze, as if listening to Mr. Houdini's fading footsteps. She then asked, "Regarding last evening, my dear, did the gruff bull stomp his foot at the frisky calf who wanted to play?" I pursed my lips at my place in the metaphor. The gruff bull did have to change the topic of discussion a bit abruptly at one point, I explained. "I must tell you something, Lida," Vera said as she began feeling above the door frames in search of a clue. "In the years we've spent together, I've watched you blossom into womanhood. You've gone about it all wrong, becoming as pretty as you have. Pretty women are virtually indistinguishable from one another." I helped myself to the vanity chair. "If only you had met me earlier, Vera, perhaps your influence would have made me as unique as yourself." This time, Vera pursed her lips. She appeared to be reviewing my comment for any traces of slander. I decided to grant the jury a recess regarding it. Following her instructions from previous investigations, I remained silent as Vera proceeded to check behind the furniture and pictures, under the carpets and mattress, and along the woodwork and windows. She even tapped on walls, listening for hollow spots. Finally, she looked at me and shrugged. Sitting on the side of the bed, Vera said, "I forgot to ask you about your afternoon trip to see Lady Liberty. Does the grand girl appear very different from the last time you saw her?" "Of course she does," I asserted. "I saw her from the other side this time." "Oh, Vera, it's heartbreaking that you've lived so many years in this city and have never seen the Statue of Liberty." "Yes, yes, one day." Her eyes brightened. "But I did find some interesting evidence at City Hall this afternoon, or rather a lack of evidence. There is no death certificate available for our red-headed dancer." "You checked the name I had written down for you?" "Repeatedly." "Well, then, that suggests that Miss Dunwittle still walks among the living."
and she is very likely Mr. Lavelle's source of information regarding her unsavory liaison with our client. Making matters worse, I also discovered that while Mr. Houdini was betraying his wife, Mrs. Dunwiddle was betraying her husband. Gracious, you found a marriage certificate? I found a death certificate. Vera crossed to where we had placed our belongings and pulled a notebook out of her satchel. After flipping a few pages, she read, "It was dated 1902, after Mr. Houdini left for Europe. Mr. Eugene Dunwiddle, spouse of Dolly Dunwiddle, was a sword swallower who died of internal injuries. A hazard of the trade, I suppose, but still a grisly end for poor Eugene. I deliberately didn't mention it to our client." "You also didn't mention that we might now be dealing with an actual ghost," I remarked. "Well, this puts us back on familiar ground. Shall I take out the oboes? It's dark enough now." Vera nodded. I retrieved our oboe cases, and we assembled the two musical instruments. We next extinguished the lights. Vera sounded a sustained B-flat on her oboe, and I droned a high G on mine. This exact timbre of harmony creates vibrations that illuminate any breaches between the physical and spirit realms. The illumination appears as a violet glow, the color that science confirms wavers on the precipice of visibility. Though we played the B-flat and high G in about as many spots as the room afforded, not a single violet-edged wobbling hole appeared. Vera signaled for me to stop playing. In the moonlight coming through the window, she returned to the side of the bed, where she rested two fingers on her jaw. "No violet equals no dimensional ruptures," she pondered aloud. "No ruptures equals no guilt in the room, or at least no guilt powerful enough to cause the ruptures." Snapping upright, she protested, "But this makes no sense at all. No guilt? Remind me what the ghost says." "According to Mr. Houdini, it whispers, 'Tell her I'm sorry for what I did,' and nothing more." "He confessed his marital infidelity to us, and yet the man feels no remorse, even when disembodied whispers implied that his wife there beside him deserves an apology. I am flabbergasted." Not knowing what else to say, I suggested, "Perhaps all that's left to us is to bring back the lights and wait until 10:30. Only then can we hope to trick anyone spying on the house into initiating the whispers." "We must do exactly that, my dear. This pudding gets thicker the more it's stirred." Once sufficient time had passed with the lights up, Vera dragged the vanity chair close to the head of the bed where Mr. Houdini indicated he had heard the phenomenon. She sat there. I then extinguished the last light and assumed my post on the edge of the bed. Toward the end of the first hour of maintaining our watch, or rather our listen, I began to feel my head drooping. Sometime during the second hour, I began to slouch backward more than once. Vera pinched me on the arm each time to bring me back to soldierly attention. As on our previous outings, I was astounded by Vera's ability to remain sharp and virtually motionless through a long night of ghost hunting. Eventually, all sounds coming from other rooms in the house passed away. Even the slow approach and departure of hooves on the street became infrequent. I hadn't realized that my eyelids had been closed for some time when they snapped open at the sound of a thud. I turned quickly toward Vera. Though the moonlight had now passed, I discerned her shadowy figure raise a hand, cueing me to remain still. With the grace of a creeping cat, she rose from her chair and moved toward the center of the room. She moved toward the door, indicating that the sound had originated from beyond it. There came another thud. This time it was followed closely by the creaks of bed springs in the distance, and then footfalls rushing down the hall toward us. A gentle yet impatient rapping sounded on the bedroom door itself. "Are you still there, Miss Van Slyke?" hissed the voice of Mr. Houdini through the door. "I heard the whispers again. But how could they have known that I'd switched rooms? Miss Van Slyke, how could they have known where I'd be?"
On the ride to confront our adversary, Mr. Lavelle, Vera glared out the coach window while persistently tapping her chin. Mr. Houdini leaned toward her and said softly, "Not to worry, Miss Van Slyke. True, you weren't able to explain what mechanism accounts for the whispers. If I understand what you explained earlier, though, you've shown there was no aperture, no channel, no medium, if you will, for those whispers to have come from the spirit world." Vera continued to look out at the passing buildings. "Medium is the right word in this case," she snarled, "since Lavelle might go so far as to claim that you yourself are unconsciously a psychic sensitive. That, then, can explain the whispers." I submitted, "But we also have our photograph and obituary notice to show that Lavelle's are as phony." Vera rested her hand on my arm. "Helpful, but not conclusive. Many a spiritualist has claimed that faking what they do fails to disprove what they do. Any of us can put on a false mustache, a pair of pince-nez, and a Rough Rider's hat, but that doesn't mean that Theodore Roosevelt isn't actually our president." Mr. Houdini chuckled. He leaned back and began to straighten the cuffs on his shirt and coat. He said, "Remember that Lavelle has never mentioned the whispers. It's possible he has no knowledge of them. Even if he does, I'll wager he's counting far too much on that ace up his sleeve, given our findings." Vera turned suddenly to our client. "And since we only have a queen up our sleeve, it is vitally important that none of us mention the ghostly whisperer. Are we thoroughly understood on this point?" Mr. Houdini chuckled again. "Are we clear on this point?" Vera reiterated pointedly. Our client resumed attending to the correctness of his cuffs. I saw Vera's eyes narrow as she stared at him. She remained silent until, with that familiar flourish of his hand, the magician let us know that we had arrived at Mr. Lavelle's brownstone. After Mr. Houdini introduced Vera and me as a pair of psychical researchers from Chicago, Mr. Lavelle escorted us to his parlor. I immediately recognized features of the room as being tailored for seances. The center table, for instance, had a top that extended farther on one end than the other. Applying one's elbows to that longer side could easily rock the entire table. In addition, rather than a door or open entryway to the next room, there hung a dark, heavy curtain. It granted a Confederate covert passage once the room goes dark.
"Would you ladies prefer coffee or tea?"
asked Mr. Lavelle with a cloying smile. He was a gangly man with dark hair. His most noticeable feature was that eye patch we had first seen in the fake photograph. I assumed it was a mere affectation, designed to imply that the wearer's restricted vision in this world must surely have sharpened his insight into the world beyond. Not until our refreshment arrived did Mr. Lavelle commence the transaction.
"Let's discuss the proposal that brings us together. Sir, are you prepared to pay the $1,000 I mentioned in my letters? I assure you that I could earn more by going to the press with the story that the late Miss Dunwhiddle told me. It has both scandal and the supernatural, and reporters these days are so very vulturous when it comes to either of those."
He resumed his honeyed smile. "There is no such word as vulturous," Vera stated blandly. After tilting his head, he asked,
"Are you sure?"
"I ought to be. I'm a reporter."
Mr. Lavelle licked some of the honey off of his lips. Our client interceded. "But to answer the question about your proposal, as it seems we're not calling it blackmail, I absolutely refuse to pay you so much as a wooden nickel. You see, I am fully prepared to respond to your chicanery with a bit of my own. Miss Van Slyke, would you care to present our counter-proposal?" "Yes, thank you," she replied. "As regards your photograph, does your good eye allow you to recognize the dearly departed in this portrait of our own making?" I passed our photograph to Mr. Lavelle. His good eye shot up and down between my face and the picture several times before he managed to reconstruct his smile.
"But Of course, I also have the newspaper notice of Miss Dunwiddle's death to confirm that the woman in my photo is no longer living."
"Ah, yes, the death notice," Vera said. "Now, not everyone is strong with names, sir, but do you recall the name of the pretty miss beside me now? You were introduced only moments ago." I passed our newspaper clipping to him. Mr. Lavelle stared some time at the clipping before reading aloud,
"Lucille Parcell, the pretty miss."
He then cleared his throat and continued to stare downward at the clipping. I took the opportunity to discreetly tap the arms of Vera and Mr. Houdini. Upon gaining their notice, I cocked my head in the direction of the curtain. My intent was to signal that Mr. Lavelle was most likely not acting alone. My two companions nodded. I assumed they were likewise recognizing that the man before us lacked the cunning to have devised this scheme by himself. Indeed, I reconsidered his eye patch. No longer did I see it as an indication of sophisticated subterfuge. Instead, it suggested congenital clumsiness. As if cracking a whip, Mr. Houdini snatched Mr. Lavelle's attention with a sudden guffaw. "Those were both schoolboy tricks, but I confess I haven't a clue as to how you managed to create those spooky whispers in my house, and to perform them night after night, in different rooms yet. Remarkable." Slowly, Vera pivoted her head to our client, narrowing her eyes into the same scowl that she had given him in the coach. Mr. Lavelle blinked his eye several times.
"Did you say whispers? Dolly, Mrs. Dunwiddle didn't tell me, the spirit of Mrs. Dunwiddle didn't tell me about any whispers."
Mr. Houdini continued. "I won't ask you to divulge your secret, of course, but do let me compliment you. That trick, sir, was pure genius, if indeed it were a trick at all. I called in these ghost hunters, hoping to reveal some physical explanation for the whispers. Miss Van Slyke, in your opinion, was there a trick at work here?" Vera sighed while accepting her role in the playlet being directed by our client. Standing, she recited, "I was unable to expose any mechanism or any other physical means whereby the whispers might have been produced." She then curtsied and resumed her seat. Exactly then, the curtain behind Mr. Lavelle rippled. The magician very likely noticed this and proceeded, "But I never quite understood the meaning of the message being whispered. Lavelle, if it was really you, please clarify what was being said over and over." The medium's mouth hung open a moment. Sounding like a teased child, he whined,
"Oh, what was being said?"
Mr. Houdini fiddled his fingers as if casting a spell. He intoned, "Tell her I'm sorry for what I did." Only that each time, never anything else. "Tell her I'm sorry for what I did." Suddenly a woman burst through the curtain. Her entrance was indeed startling. However, I do not believe that any of us were surprised by the color of her hair.
"Now what the devil does that mean?"
demanded the redhead.
"What would Eugene have done that he needed to apologize to me for?"
After putting her hands firmly on her hips, she peered around as if slowly realizing there were strangers in the room. Mr. Houdini stood up to announce, "Ladies, allow me to present the late Dolly Dunwiddle." Though a devious smirk had come to his mouth, he abstained from making the customary grand flourish with his hand. In unison, Vera and I also rose. Mr. Lavelle finally did too. He whimpered,
I don't understand. Dolly, you said Eugene was your husband, but he died, you said. And now these whispers? So was there really a ghost?"
Imbecile!
Mrs. Dunwhiddle groaned, punctuating her statement with a wallop to the back of Mr. Lavelle's head.
If it wasn't a trick, then it must have been Eugene's ghost. He told me at the hospital that I would be punished for how I treated him, that my punishment would come from the next world.
Mr. Houdini gestured for Vera and me to head to the door before him. However, Mrs. Dunwhiddle interrupted.
But, Harry, why would Eugene ask you to apologize to me if either of us had a reason to... But what did he do behind my back?
The flushed face of the red-headed woman suddenly paled. She clapped her hand over her mouth and froze. She might have been sensing a digestive problem on the rise. Another possibility is she recognized that Mr. Houdini had duped her. That seems to be a secret known only by those beyond the veil, Mr. Houdini said decisively. Mr. Lavelle, as Dolly's spirit has apparently reconciled with her body, I think it best that we bid you farewell. But I thank you, sir. You've inspired me to expose you spiritualists far more vigorously in the future than I have today. Mr. Lavelle stumbled as he dumbly accompanied us to the door. We left the widow Dunwhiddle in her state of nervous befuddlement, a condition that was likely to haunt her for a long time to come.
Please confirm 3 of my suspicions, my dear, Vera said. We were back in our hotel. We had taken a room among the top floors of the Seville, one of New York's newest and tallest hotels. Vera was unbuttoning and unhooking a few of the tighter spots of her apparel, not to change outfits, but to relax after a vexing day. If any of those suspicions concern the resurrection of Dolly Dunwhiddle, I replied, I think you should have asked Mr. Houdini while you had the chance during our return trip. Very likely he's the only one who can divulge what occurred behind the scenes of this afternoon's matinee performance. I don't believe that man would have ever told us the truth, but I will grant that he certainly has a talent for escaping all kinds of chains. I smiled. Yes, but I feel like we were little more than tools concealed for that escape. Handsomely paid tools, mind you. Nonetheless, let's discuss your 3 suspicions. First, we never heard the ghostly whispers that brought us here. Indeed, I highly doubt that Houdini ever heard them. No, we were called upon to bring the veneer of validation to the ghost. The fact that we traveled so far to investigate the whispers gives that ghost a certain weight, doesn't it? The illusion thereof, I amended. Yet how did Houdini know that the red-headed dancer would so quickly assume the whispers came from her late husband? Did he even know that Eugene Dunwhiddle is dead? Vera began to pace. This brings me to my second suspicion. Did the man simply perform the medium's standard ruse, the one in which he claims he's been contacted by a spirit who has unfinished business with the poor Patsy? I think so, I said. The safer method is for the medium to say that he has been contacted by a spirit who loved the Patsy very much. Almost everybody will think of some deceased friend or relative who fits the bill. That's when many will take out their money to hear more. Mr. Houdini probably deduced that Dolly was involved in the scheme, given Lavelle's limited vision, let's call it. So he simply held up an empty sheet. He knew Dolly well enough to predict that she would fill that sheet with whatever ghost was lingering in the back of her mind. Vera stopped pacing. She crossed her arms and raised them to lean upon the window frame beside her. Outside, the sky over the city was a darkening orange. The last mystery, she said, is the lack of any ruptures between the dimensions. The lack of a ghost is one thing. Every ghost hunter expects to come up empty-handed now and again. But the lack of guilt, our not finding any violet holes in that bedroom where the sinner sleeps with the woman he sinned against, I can barely form a theory. On the one side, did his guilt simply evaporate with the passage of time? Or, on the other, did it so plague him that he often slept in another room? Vera tapped a finger against the window pane. I walked over to her. We had an impressive view of the metropolis and the multitude of lights that one by one were appearing before us. Do you remember telling me about the writer who ruined the public reputation of your mentor, Harry Ascot? I saw Vera nod, or rather, I saw her reflection in the window. I suspect Harry Houdini refuses to meet a similar fate. He retains complete control over his public portraiture, and indeed paints that picture himself. I wonder, though, if he doesn't paint himself in a style that is very much— I paused to think of the best word. Romanticized, Vera offered. Exactly. And in romanticizing how others see him, perhaps our magician has himself become fooled by his own larger-than-life image. That, then, saves him from any feelings of guilt, any merely human feelings of guilt. Vera smiled. Using the window as a mirror, she straightened a strand of her stubbornly wavy hair. She then stepped back to make a dramatic, sweeping gesture to the humanity beyond the window. And that, my dear, is a magic trick we all perform, she concluded. Houdini Slept Here by Tim Prossel. You know, Vera Van Slyke must have led a very interesting life. Her path kept crossing with major celebrities from her era, which is the late 1800s and especially the early 1900s. Here, for instance, she meets a young Harry Houdini, and this comes from a book titled Help for the Haunted, A Decade of Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mysteries. In this book, there are 13 chronicles of Vera's paranormal investigations, and they all kind of overlap. One leads into the next. For instance, here there was a quick mention of someone named Harry Bergson. Well, later he becomes very important, especially to Lida, but also to Vera. In another Vera Van Slyke ghostly mystery titled Guilt is a Ghost, we find out that Vera had a long-term friendship with a man named William James. He's not exactly a household word, but his brother might be Henry James. He's the author of Turn of the Screw and a bunch of very well-respected fiction. But William James was a Harvard professor who had an important role in establishing psychology as an academic field. He was also very interested in what was then called psychical research. He sat in on a lot of seances to try to figure out what was going on. So historically, he's a very interesting guy. It wasn't until 1923 that Vera took a train ride with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And this is narrated in a book titled The Hound of the Seven Mounds. By 1923, Conan Doyle was touring the United States and giving lectures on spiritualism, something that he believed in very deeply. It's pretty well known that Conan Doyle was also buddies with Harry Houdini, who was very much the Scully, very much the skeptic of the duo, while Conan Doyle was the Mulder, the believer. If you'd like to find out more about the Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mystery Series, please visit brombonesbooks.com. On each page for each book, there's a section titled The History Behind the Haunting, and there I list some of the actual history that I discovered is part of these chronicles. Again, I don't know how much of it is true and how much of it is fiction. I'm going to leave that up to you. Please visit brownbonesbooks.com, take a look at the books in the Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mystery Series, and I think you might find something interesting there. I'm Tim Prossel. Thank you very much for listening.